I am Linda Carter, and this is my story. The kind no one really asks for, but life writes it anyway. 3 days after my face appeared on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, I got a call I never thought I'd hear again. I was in my kitchen, peeling a green apple, the kind I always bought in bulk, though I lived alone, when the phone rang, its sound sharp against the quiet hum of the old refrigerator. I almost didn't answer. It was an unknown number from Connecticut, but something in me, perhaps intuition or foolish hope, urged me to pick up. "Mum, it's me, Samantha." For a moment everything stopped. My hand froze mid-air, the peeler slipped into the sink with a soft clink, the apple rolled slowly off the counter, and yet my mind moved faster than it had in years, pulling memories from corners I hadn't touched in decades. That voice, that name, that word Mum hit me harder than any headline could. I hadn't heard her voice in 28 years, yet somehow it sounded both familiar and unfamiliar, like a photograph of a place you once lived in but can't quite place anymore. The last time I heard her speak it was with anger and accusation, her eyes sharp, her jaw set, and her words meant to hurt more than they revealed. But now there was something different, something quieter, more hesitant, like walking into a room and not being sure you're welcome. "I saw the article," she said, and I could tell she was trying to sound casual, like this was just a normal call between mother and daughter, not the first conversation since she was 35, and I was a woman begging to be part of her wedding. "I didn't even know you were still in healthcare, and the startup, it's incredible." Incredible? That's the word she used. Not congratulations, not I'm proud of you, just incredible. $12 million, the result of 4 years of exhausting work, long nights, aging bones, and learning technology I had no business understanding, all wrapped into one neat article that described me as a late-blooming tech success. That was the version of me the world had just discovered. But Samantha had known me differently, hadn't wanted to know me at all, not for nearly 3 decades. "You must be surprised," she continued, and I could hear her breathing change, the way people do when they're unsure whether their words will land softly or crash. "I wanted to ask if you'd like to come over for dinner, just the family, this Sunday. It's been a long time." Dinner, just like that, 28 years of silence, and now dinner, not Thanksgiving, not Mother's Day, not even her son's graduation, which I had watched through a live stream that someone shared publicly by accident. Just Sunday, just dinner. I stared out the window where the trees had started collecting frost again, the kind of cold that didn't bite, just reminded you how still life could become. "Yes," I said, letting the word rest in the space between us. "It has been a long time." I didn't say yes to the dinner, not yet. I told her I'd think about it, that I appreciated the call, and we hung up, the whole conversation lasting 4 minutes and 23 seconds, just enough time for a memory to come back, but not enough for a wound to heal. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the edge of my bed holding a photo of Samantha when she was 6, the one where she wore a pink tutu and her 2 front teeth were missing, her hair in pigtails, her cheeks round and full of mischief. And I wondered how the years had shaped her face, how time had shaped her voice, how life had shaped her choices. She called me Mum again, but it wasn't the word that broke me open. It was the timing. 3 days after I became someone worth writing about, 3 days after the world suddenly knew my name, 3 days after my bank account changed, after my life, at least on paper, became enviable. And now she remembered me, or maybe just remembered what I could offer. I wanted to believe it was more than that, I really did. But after 28 years, belief doesn't come easy. Trust doesn't come quickly, and wounds don't close on their own. What do you do when someone who erased you comes back with a smile and a dinner invitation? You remember everything, and you begin again, but not from where they left you, from where you found yourself after they were gone. So I stayed up, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I finally knew what I had to say. Not to her, not yet, but to myself, and maybe, someday, to the people who think silence is safety, or that time will erase what it hasn't repaired. I had a story, not the one the press printed, not the one Samantha likely told herself, not the convenient version, but the real one. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to tell it. I wasn't always the woman people write articles about. And I certainly wasn't always someone my daughter would call just to hear my voice. In fact, for most of my life, I was invisible in plain sight. The kind of woman you walk past in a hospital hallway, tired shoes, tired eyes, and a badge that says RN, even though it should have said everything, because that's what I was, everything to Samantha. I gave birth to her in the winter of 1960, in a small community hospital in upstate New York, the kind of place where the walls always smelled like bleach and cold air, where the nurses knew you by name because you were one of them. I was 22, single and terrified, and yet when I held her, everything inside me went quiet. There was no plan, no savings, no family to lean on, but there was her, with her small fists and impossibly dark eyes, and that was enough. Raising Samantha alone wasn't easy, not by any measure of the word. I worked double shifts at St. Clair's Hospital, sometimes even triple during flu season. I would sleep in the break room with my shoes still on and then run to the daycare across town before they closed, just to see her smile through the window before she noticed the bags under my eyes. We didn't have much, but we had rituals. Every Sunday we'd walk to the second-hand bookstore and I'd let her pick one book, no matter how tight the budget. She always reached for the ones with animals or space adventures. She'd read them out loud while I prepared boxed macaroni, and sometimes she'd fall asleep mid-sentence, the book resting on her chest like it was guarding her dreams. I remember one winter, we lost heat for 3 days, and I layered all our clothes on the bed, crawled in beside her, and told stories from my childhood just to keep her distracted. She didn't complain once, just curled closer and whispered, "It's okay, Mummy. This feels like camping." And I remember thinking how grace can live in the smallest mouths. When Samantha was 10, she got accepted into a private middle school on scholarship, the kind where parents drove Volvos and wore expensive raincoats. I scrubbed extra floors and took weekend shifts to buy her a decent pair of shoes and a proper backpack. She hated being the girl with the old books, but she loved the library, and I watched her confidence grow, step by step, even as mine thinned. By the time she reached high school, she had dreams of becoming an illustrator. She would draw for hours, sketching animals in astronaut suits or old ladies baking potions in secret kitchens. I encouraged it quietly, submitting her work to contests without telling her. And when one of them won, she cried in the hallway, held the certificate like it was magic. I cried too, but alone, in the break room, holding my coffee like a lifeline. Things began to change when she met Richard. He was 5 years older, came from money, the kind of boy who wore button-ups without wrinkles and said things like legacy in casual conversation. He had charm, I'll admit that, the kind that masked something colder underneath, the kind that made you feel flattered before you realized you were being sized up. I met him once at dinner. He shook my hand like it was a formality and called me Linda with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He asked what I did, and when I said I was a nurse, he nodded and said, "That's important work," in the same tone you'd use to praise someone for folding towels. After that, I saw Samantha begin to change. Her wardrobe shifted, her speech softened around the edges. She stopped drawing, said it was childish, said Richard helped her see things differently. She switched her major from fine arts to economics, and when I asked why, she just smiled and said, "It's more practical." As if practicality had ever been her language before. I bit my tongue, tried not to overstep, but every conversation began to feel like a minefield, every opinion met with silence or that look, the one that said I didn't understand the world she was entering, and maybe I didn't, maybe I never would, but I did understand her, and I knew she was slowly erasing pieces of herself just to fit into someone else's frame. The wedding was small and grand at the same time, hosted in a glass-walled venue in Westchester. I wasn't asked to help plan anything, just given a seat assignment and told to wear navy. When I arrived, I realized my name wasn't even on the family list. I was placed near the back, next to the catering staff, and for a moment I thought it was a mistake, until I saw Samantha walk down the aisle and glance past me like I wasn't there. After the vows, after the champagne and the speeches from Richard's side that mentioned legacy, heritage, and success, I found Samantha in the hallway, asked her if we could speak. She looked tired, or maybe just done. And when I asked why I wasn't included, why I wasn't asked to say anything, she said, "Because you embarrass me, Mum. Your world doesn't fit here." I stood still, my heart somewhere between breaking and trying not to, and then she added, softer but crueler, "You're just a bitter old woman who envies me." And in that moment, I knew something was ending, not just the argument, but a chapter I never agreed to close. That was the last time we spoke. She never sent a card, never picked up my calls, never told me when she moved out west, or when her son was born. I found out through a neighbour who saw it on Facebook. I sent a blanket with his initials embroidered by hand. It was returned unopened. Years passed like leaves falling unnoticed. I worked quietly, saved modestly, aged slowly, alone but not entirely unhappy. I still went to bookstores, still made macaroni on Sundays, still talked to the photographs when it got too quiet. But some silences are too loud, and hers never stopped echoing, not really. The years that followed weren't marked by milestones or celebrations. They were measured in small things, in quiet mornings and long nights, in unopened letters and the way my phone never lit up with her name, in the weight of birthdays that passed like ordinary Tuesdays, in the way I avoided walking past art stores because they reminded me of the girl who once believed magic could live in ink. I kept working because work was the only place where I didn't feel unnecessary. I moved from hospital floors to private elder care, took care of people whose own children rarely visited, wiped foreheads and changed dressings, and whispered reassurance to strangers in the dark, somehow hoping that kindness, even displaced, would come back around. I tried once, during my 52nd birthday, to send Samantha a letter, not to ask for anything, just to tell her I was still here, that the door wasn't locked, just closed. I included a photograph of us from the summer she turned 9, the one where she wore overalls and I'd forgotten to take off my nurse's badge before the picnic. I never got a reply, but I knew she'd received it because I paid extra for tracking. I watched the delivery update go from in transit to delivered, then nothing, like shouting into a canyon and hearing no echo. Time, as it does, kept moving. I tried to keep up. I took night classes in health technology, not because I had a plan, but because I couldn't let my mind rust. It was around then I began noticing how many elderly patients struggled with breathing support at home. They couldn't afford complex machines, and the existing options were clunky or unreliable. I started sketching out a design, crude at first, scribbled on the back of grocery receipts, then on graph paper, then finally into software I taught myself to use at midnight while my joints ached and the rest of the world slept. By the time I turned 58, I had a working prototype, small, portable, with an emergency backup and voice-activated controls for those with limited mobility. I called it Carey's. Because ease was what people like me had been missing all our lives, I pitched it to a few local clinics, then to small investors. Most ignored me, some smiled politely and never called back. One woman, a former engineer whose mother had died due to respiratory failure, said yes, she believed in it, and more importantly, in me. We started small, assembling units in her garage, testing each one ourselves, selling directly to families we found through hospice networks and senior communities. Word spread, slowly at first, then faster when a regional newspaper wrote a story about 2 women over 60 launching a medical startup. We weren't flashy, we weren't polished, but we were relentless. In the 4th year, Carey's was purchased by a large medical device company for $12 million. I remember sitting across the table from men in suits and wondering if they realized. I still packed my own lunch in a paper bag. They offered champagne, I asked for tea, they asked what I'd do next. I told them I'd think about it. Truth was, I didn't know how to be rich. I only knew how to be useful. The day after the deal went public, I walked into my old apartment and saw 3 letters in the mail slot. One from the hospital asking me to return as a guest speaker. One from a charity offering to name a wing after me, and one handwritten no return address. But I knew the handwriting even after all these years, even after all the silence. I didn't open it right away. I made tea, sat by the window, watched the trees shift under early spring wind, then finally I unfolded the page. It was short, the kind of note you write when you've spent too long not writing anything at all. Mom, I saw the article. I was surprised. I didn't know you were doing all of that. I wanted to say I'm happy for you. I hope you're well. Samantha. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no "I miss you." Just words that hovered between acknowledgement and calculation, and yet I read it 3 times. Once for the message, once for the absence of emotion, and once because I didn't know what to feel. 3 days later she called, the same voice, softer now, or maybe I just wanted it to be. She said she wanted to reconnect, that she thought it was time, that maybe we could have dinner. I said I'd think about it, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to remember what power felt like in my own mouth. Sunday came faster than I expected. I stood in front of my closet longer than necessary, unsure what to wear to the first dinner with your estranged child after 28 years. I settled on navy, not because I still obeyed the memory of her wedding dress code, but because it reminded me of who I used to be, steady, quiet, overlooked. Her house was smaller than I imagined, cozy in a curated way, like someone trying to look casual with expensive things they could no longer afford. She greeted me at the door with a hesitant hug, one arm, light touch, as if afraid I'd disappear or turn to salt if held too tightly. Inside, there were framed photos of her family, vacations, school events, but none of me, no trace that I had ever existed in her world beyond genetics. She introduced me to her husband again, Richard, who looked older, greyer, but still carried that polished detachment. He shook my hand like a businessman meeting a vendor, and I saw in his eyes something I hadn't seen before: uncertainty. Dinner was awkward in the way polite gatherings can be when truth sits in the room like a guest who wasn't invited. We talked about weather, news, her son's college, how they'd downsized recently, how the market was unpredictable. I nodded, I smiled, I said little. Then she said it, the sentence she had been building towards since the moment she picked up the phone. "I read that you started a foundation," she said, "for caregivers. It's really admirable. I was wondering if maybe there's a way we could get involved. Richard's business is going through some things, and—" I let her speak, every word filling the silence she left behind all those years, every phrase revealing what hadn't changed, not really. And when she finished, I looked at her and said, "That foundation doesn't have space for people who forgot what care means." She looked like I'd slapped her. Richard shifted in his seat. Their son looked down at his plate, and I realized then that the dinner wasn't for reconciliation, it was for rescue. I stood, placed my napkin on the table and said, "I didn't come here because I missed you. I came to remind myself why I no longer do." No one followed me out the door. I didn't cry when I left their house. I didn't drive fast or play angry music or call anyone to tell the story. I just drove in silence, letting the road carry me back to my apartment in the quiet part of Bridgeport, the sun already setting behind the long rows of trees that lined the street. And as I turned the key in my front door, I felt something shift, not break, not collapse, just shift, like a book finally closing after staying open for too long. That night I didn't replay the conversation over and over the way I used to do when someone hurt me. I didn't wonder if I had been too harsh, if maybe she had really meant it, if maybe deep down she still loved me. I had spent too many years wondering what Samantha felt, too many holidays walking past my mailbox hoping for a card, too many birthdays whispering her name in the dark. I was done giving away parts of myself to someone who only showed up when my story made headlines. Instead, I turned inward, not to collapse, but to gather myself, to take inventory of who I had become after years of survival. I wasn't just the woman who raised a daughter alone, who stitched together 2 decades of motherhood on a nurse's salary. I was now someone who had built something, not just wealth, but impact, something with weight and worth, something that could stretch beyond me. The day after that dinner, I met with my lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Elliot, who had helped me set up the first stages of the Careys Foundation months earlier. I asked him to make 3 things legally binding. First, that none of the money from the acquisition would go to Samantha or her family under any circumstance. Second, that half of my wealth would be allocated to fund scholarships for daughters of single mothers pursuing healthcare careers. And third, that I would be donating a wing to the senior facility I had once worked in, renamed not after me but after my own mother, who died when I was 15 and taught me that survival is its own kind of legacy. Elliot nodded slowly as I spoke, typed each clause carefully, and when he looked up, he didn't ask me why, he just said, "You've thought this through." And I said, "For 28 years." And he said nothing more. I didn't feel bitter or angry or vengeful. I felt clean, as if something inside me had finally come into alignment. For years I had lived in a waiting room of the heart, hoping one day my daughter would open the door. Now I was building a life outside that room, and the air tasted better here. I visited the Careys office a few days later, not to interfere, just to sit in the back and listen to the young engineers brainstorm ideas I could barely follow. I smiled watching them, reminded of how much I had learned, how far I had come, how nothing about my story was accidental. Everything was earned piece by piece. At lunch, I walked to a nearby diner and ordered the same thing I used to eat on my night shifts: black coffee, tuna on rye, a side of applesauce. As I ate, I overheard a group of students from the local college discussing scholarship deadlines. One of them said her mum couldn't co-sign the loan, and for a moment I wanted to reach across the aisle and say, "Tell her she's not alone." But I didn't. I just left a larger tip than usual and walked out into the cold Connecticut wind. That evening I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a letter not to Samantha, but to myself, to the woman I had once been, the young version who gave birth alone and walked home from work with sore feet and frozen fingers, the version who held her daughter close while the world outside went quiet. I told her she had done enough, that the weight she carried wasn't in vain, that even if no one said thank you, she had still built something unshakable. I folded the letter, placed it in a small tin box where I kept other things I never showed anyone: my daughter's first drawing, my old nursing pin, the name badge from my final shift, and I closed it gently, not to hide it away but to honor it. From that day on, I stopped referring to Samantha in the present tense when people asked if I had children. I didn't lie. I just said once, and left it at that, not because I had disowned her, but because I had finally accepted that some stories don't need retelling. They just need closure. There was peace in that decision, not the loud kind, but the kind that comes when the storm has passed, and you realize the roof held strong, the windows stayed shut, and you are still standing. Weeks passed after the dinner without a word from Samantha or Richard, and I didn't expect one because the silence that followed wasn't unfamiliar. It had the same weight and texture as the 28 years that came before it, only now I welcomed it. Now it wasn't an abandonment, it was a boundary, and I had learned the difference. I spent my mornings walking the park trails near the edge of the city, where the air smelled like wet pine, and the benches were usually empty except for the regulars. An older man who fed the birds and a retired teacher who knitted silently and nodded politely every time I passed. There was comfort in these quiet routines, in the rhythm of lives lived without performance, in the way strangers didn't ask about family or history, only shared the same stillness. One morning as I left the park, my phone buzzed, and this time it wasn't Samantha. It was a message from Elliot, my lawyer, asking if I had a moment to review an urgent request. I called him back and he sounded uncomfortable, said he had received a letter addressed to me through his office from Richard. Apparently they were facing legal troubles far more serious than I'd been led to believe. Not just business downturns, but federal investigation into securities fraud, asset freezing, and possible bankruptcy. Richard had written the letter himself, but signed it with both their names, asking if I would be willing to advance a portion of your recent earnings to help them cover legal fees and preserve the family's legacy. He added that, as Samantha's mother, surely you understand how important this is for your grandson's future. I listened in silence as Elliot read sections of the letter aloud, his voice steady but hesitant, as if waiting for me to explode or break down or react in any dramatic way, but I didn't, because there was nothing left in me to rupture, not over that, not any more. I asked him to reply with a short statement, professionally written, that no funds would be given, directly or indirectly, now or in the future, and that all communication of this nature should cease. Elliot agreed, and I thanked him, then hung up and stared out my window at the soft grey sky and thought not of Samantha or her husband, or even the grandson I'd never met, but of the hospital laundry room I used to cry in on my breaks, The nights I spent eating crackers and canned soup because Samantha needed new school supplies. The time I stood outside her recital after a double shift, holding flowers I couldn't afford while she avoided eye contact because I was still in scrubs. This wasn't revenge. I wasn't denying them out of spite or bitterness. I simply didn't owe them rescue. I had already paid too much in years. In silence, in dignity, I had earned my peace, and I wasn't going to trade it for their desperation. Still, life has a way of circling back in ways you don't expect, and one rainy afternoon about a month later, I received a letter not from Samantha or Richard, but from someone else entirely. It was handwritten in careful script, addressed simply to Miss Carter, and when I opened it, I recognized the name at the bottom immediately, Daniel, her son. He introduced himself formally, said he hoped the letter wasn't unwelcome, that he had recently learned more about me and felt compelled to reach out. He said he had stumbled across an interview I gave during the launch of the Careys Foundation, where I spoke about the importance of supporting caregivers and the dignity of aging. He wrote that he had no idea what had transpired between his mother and me, but that the story had moved him, that he had grown up with a lot of unanswered questions, and maybe this was a way to start filling in the blanks. He didn't ask for money or help or even a meeting, just said that if I ever wanted to talk, he would be honored, and included his email and a university mailing address in Boston. I sat at my table holding the letter for a long time, not sure what to feel, because I had spent so many years being erased from their narrative that I didn't expect to be found again, especially not by someone who had no obligation to look. I didn't write back right away. Instead, I reread the letter every few nights, its tone respectful and sincere, without pressure or performance, and something about that stayed with me, not because it reopened the past, but because it hinted at a future not built on guilt or need, but maybe, just maybe, curiosity. 2 weeks later, I finally sent a short reply thanking him for his letter, saying I appreciated the kindness and that perhaps one day a coffee wouldn't be a terrible idea. I told him I wasn't angry, not at him, and that I hoped he was finding his own way, that was it. No mention of his parents, no questions, just something small and steady, like planting a seed in a garden you might never see bloom. A few days after I mailed the letter, I attended the ribbon cutting for the new elder care wing bearing my mother's name. The ceremony was modest, just how I wanted it, with a handful of staff, some residents, a few reporters, and one small moment that nearly unraveled me. During the tour, an elderly woman in a wheelchair reached out and touched my hand, said thank you with watery eyes and a voice that cracked mid-sentence. She said she used to be afraid of dying alone, but now she felt seen, felt safe. I nodded, squeezed her hand, and when I walked away, I stepped into the hallway, leaned against the wall, and wept quietly, not out of grief, but out of relief. Because for the first time in my life, I felt the full weight of what I had built, and it was solid. That evening, as I sat with a warm cup of tea in the same kitchen where I once peeled apples alone, I looked around and didn't feel the ache of absence anymore. Instead, I felt presence, of self, of peace, of the life I had chosen, even when others didn't choose me back. And as I watched the steam curl above my mug, I thought of Samantha, not with anger or longing, but with a strange sort of mercy, because sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who taught us the most about our own capacity to endure, to grow, to rise. I don't know what will happen next with Daniel. Maybe we'll meet, maybe we won't. But what matters is that I answered with grace, not because I had to, but because I finally could. Because when you stop chasing closure and start living in your own truth, you realize that peace isn't something someone else gives you, it's something you build quietly, brick by brick, until one day it stands taller than the pain that came before it. After the ceremony and the letter, and all the things I never thought I'd live long enough to experience, life returned to something quiet again. Not silent the way it used to be, but quiet in a way that felt earned, like a room that had finally been cleaned after years of clutter. I stopped watching the news every day, stopped checking the mail expecting disappointment, stopped wondering if Samantha would ever write again, and in place of all that wondering, I started doing something I hadn't allowed myself in a very long time. I started living not for duty or survival or obligation, but for joy, for lightness, for the small things that used to slip past me when my days were filled with scarcity and waiting. I began spending my mornings at a small cafe 2 blocks from my apartment, a place I had passed for years but never entered. It was warm inside, filled with wooden furniture that didn't match, and a radio that played old jazz records on loop. The girl behind the counter learned my order after the first week: black tea with honey and a blueberry scone. If they hadn't sold out yet, I would sit by the window with a book, or sometimes with nothing at all, just letting time pass without urgency, watching people rush by while I remained still. And there was power in that stillness, the kind that comes when you no longer feel the need to chase or prove or perform. Sometimes people recognized me from the article or the interview clip that still floated around the internet. They'd come up and ask about the device or the foundation or how I did it all so late in life. I'd smile and answer politely, but I never gave them the full story, not because I was hiding anything, but because the truth was too big for small talk, too heavy to hand to strangers who only saw the end and not the road it took to get there. And besides, some stories don't need to be told out loud to be understood. They just need to be lived through. I hired a small team to manage the foundation full-time, mostly women, mostly over 40, mostly people who had been passed over in every other room until someone finally saw their worth. I sat with them once a week just to listen, to remind myself where I came from, to make sure the work stayed rooted in what mattered, not in appearances or prestige, but in impact, in dignity, in the kind of care that doesn't ask for attention but gives it freely. One Saturday afternoon in early fall, I got an email from Daniel, short and kind and unassuming. He said he was coming home for a few days and wondered if I'd like to meet for a coffee near campus. He suggested a public place and said he understood if I wasn't ready or interested. I read it twice before replying, said yes, said I'd be there Friday at 10, and then didn't let myself overthink it. The cafe was small and modern, nothing like the one near my home, filled with students and loud music and the smell of espresso. I saw him before he saw me, tall like his father but with softer features, eyes that looked unsure but not guarded. He walked over slowly, holding his coffee with both hands like a peace offering. And when we sat down, we didn't talk about Samantha or the past or what was broken. We talked about books, about Boston winters, about the foundation and his studies and what he wanted to do after graduation. He said he wasn't sure yet, that the world felt too big sometimes. I told him that never really changes, but the difference is learning how to carry yourself inside it. We didn't stay long, maybe an hour. But when we stood to leave, he thanked me, and not in the casual way people thank you for time. He thanked me like he meant it, like he knew it had cost me something to say yes, and as I walked back to my car, I realized it hadn't cost me what I thought it would, because the version of me who used to carry that pain like a second skin didn't exist anymore, and the woman walking down that sidewalk didn't feel heavy, she felt whole. That night I made soup and listened to a record I hadn't played in years, Ella Fitzgerald singing under the low hum of my old stereo, and I stood in the kitchen barefoot, stirring lentils and humming along, not because I was performing happiness for anyone, but because I was living inside it, fully, finally. There are things I used to believe without question, things passed down in whispers and expectations, things like family always finds its way back, or love is unconditional, or time heals all wounds. I carried those beliefs like truths carved in stone, but stones get heavy after a while, and when you carry them long enough without stopping to ask why, they become burdens instead of foundations. It took me decades to understand that not all family is forever, that sometimes the people who share your blood will hurt you in ways no stranger ever could, not because they're evil, but because they don't know how to see you outside the frame they've created. And when you step out of that frame, when you stop shrinking to fit their comfort, they turn away, not out of hate, but out of fear, because your growth demands something of them they're not ready to give. I used to think love meant sacrificing without limits, giving without boundaries, staying even when it broke me. But now I know that real love doesn't ask you to disappear. It doesn't demand silence in exchange for closeness. It doesn't withhold affection until you earn it. Love is not a prize to be won. It's a space where both people can breathe, where dignity isn't traded for acceptance, where showing up doesn't require erasing yourself. People often ask me if I ever forgave Samantha, and I never know how to answer that in the way they want to hear because they expect a clean ending, a ribbon tied around the story that says healing happened and everyone hugged in the end. But life isn't a movie, and forgiveness isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's a quiet decision you make in the privacy of your own heart, not to erase what happened, but to stop carrying it like a badge of pain. I forgave her in pieces, not for her sake, but for mine. I forgave her when I stopped waiting for an apology, when I realized the silence between us wasn't a punishment, it was a teacher. I forgave her the day I looked at my own reflection and no longer saw a woman defined by someone else's absence. I forgave her because I wanted to be free, not from her, but from the version of myself that kept hoping she'd come back the same way she left, with sharp words and cold eyes. There's a kind of liberation that comes with choosing yourself, not in a selfish way, but in a way that honors the truth of who you are. I used to think choosing myself meant closing doors, but now I see it as opening them, doors to peace, to clarity, to relationships that don't require performance, to mornings that begin without dread, to nights that end without regret. Sometimes the people who leave you are also the ones who make space for your becoming. And that's not a lesson I learned easily. It came with aching birthdays and lonely holidays and long walks with unanswered prayers, but it also came with growth I didn't know I was capable of, with strength I didn't know lived in me, with a life I built, not because I had to prove anything, but because I finally stopped proving and started living. They say success is the best revenge, but I don't believe in revenge anymore. I believe in rising without needing an audience, in healing without demanding recognition, in creating something beautiful out of the very things meant to break you. Success didn't make me whole. Money didn't bring my daughter back. Attention didn't fill the quiet. What made me whole was the way I kept choosing to show up for myself every day, in small ways, with gentleness, with purpose, with honesty. I don't pretend to have all the answers. I still wake up some mornings and feel the echo of what was lost. I still flinch when I see mothers and daughters laughing over brunch. I still wonder if there's a version of this life where things turned out differently. But then I remember, this version, the one I'm living now, is mine, fully mine. And it may not be perfect, but it is free. And that is enough. If there's anything I would tell the woman I used to be, the one who cried in hospital bathrooms and mailed letters that were never read, it would be this: you are not too late, you are not too much, you are not the problem, your love was real, even if it wasn't returned, and your story matters even if it was never heard. Don't let anyone make you small just because they're uncomfortable with your light. Don't confuse being needed with being valued. Don't wait for permission to live a life that feels good in your bones. To anyone who has been left behind, I say this: what was lost is real, but so is what you will gain when you stop reaching for closed hands, when you stop pouring into cups that never fill yours in return. Your worth is not tied to who stays. Your strength is not defined by who sees it. You are allowed to grieve and grow at the same time, to let go without bitterness, to move forward with both grace and grit. I am Lynda Carter, and I am not just a woman who was forgotten by her daughter. I am not just a nurse or a founder or a woman in a magazine article. I am someone who kept going, who kept building, who kept believing in quiet dignity and in the kind of love that doesn't abandon itself to be chosen. And if there is anything left in me to offer, it is this truth: peace is not something you find, it is something you create, one decision at a time, one boundary at a time, one breath at a time, and that is enough.